this year we are focusing on Ray Dalio's book Principles for an entire year. And he's really big with regards to principles. And he states that, they are really kind of the driving force for him finding success at a very early age. And what I would like, something that came up as you were speaking was, the fact that you yourself went through anxiety, had a little bit of depression, etc. Can you help me to understand what principles or standards did you lean on to help you transition into a space where you had to, like, for me, if I was anxious and depressed, I don't know if I would have went into a space where that brought on more anxiety, like podcasting or into this space where you now have to help people. And I guess it depends on what brought on your anxiety and depression, but can you help me to understand the principles, the standards that you leaned on to help you kind of transition into this space and feel comfortable?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's kind of a couple different phases, right? I would say that I am currently in the phase of like, even though there are times where I might get a little bit anxious about thinking about being on a podcast, I've done enough of them where it's almost second nature at this point, and I feel as though, again, in some ways, I have been able to manage the anxiety, manage the depression, and make some strides where it's like, I wouldn't have written the books. I wouldn't have written my blogs. I wouldn't be talking to people in formats like these if I was struggling super, super hard on a daily basis. Because I've strived to be authentic. I strive to, talk the talk, walk the walk, that sort of thing. I guess getting into the other phase or the previous phase, as well as some of the principles, right, is like, before I got to the phase that I'm at right now, when I was really struggling, let's call it 8 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever it may be. I think how I like to break it down, right? And I do hope to actually address the question of which principles exactly. Mm-hmm. How I like to talk about it is like, I think with anxiety and depression, mental health, I hope it doesn't happen this way for a lot of folks, but unfortunately it does, right? And that reality is that you find yourself in so much pain all the time. Mm-hmm. And you get pushed to this point where you're like, I have to adapt. I have to change. I have to learn. I have to grow. I have to push myself into things that I'm uncomfortable with. Because if I don't, like, honestly, I might not be here anymore, right? It's like, mm-hmm. I know it's a heavy subject. I know it's a scary subject, but like, inevitably, when you talk about mental health and you talk about anxiety and depression, inevitably the S word comes up, right? And it's like, unfortunately, it's just a matter of fact that, like, when you struggle that hard, like, you may have eventually get to the point where you're like, I don't know if I can keep going on, right? And so for me, not that it was always that kind of battle in my head of saying, do I want to be alive or do I not? It was more like me knowing that if I wanted to keep going on, if like, I was like, I'm in so much pain all the time, like, and I want to keep going, right? So in order to do that, I need to clear the hurdles that are in my way, figure out how to manage this stuff, and then get back to healthy functioning. So if we're talking about principles, right, I didn't exactly identify them.
One of the ones that came at me was the fact that you just had to do it. Just do it. You had to adapt to the environment that you were now trying to embark upon, and you just did it. Sometimes we don't realize that it's that simple. Like, we always feel like you have to have, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3, but sometimes it's just about getting out there, doing it, facing your fear. I have a sweatshirt that I always wear. It's called Faith Over Fear. And you just have to face your fears. And actually within a couple of books that I've read as it relates to principles, they talk about that. Sometimes you just have to do it. There's no way to do it but to go through it. So yes, I definitely caught that when you shared that. Maybe another piece that I wanted to touch on was with regards to just doing it, if you will. Were there any other things that you had to consider to help you find success within this profession? Because when I hear that you were a software engineer and you were transitioning into this space, do you limit yourself in this space because you're not technically, how do I want to say, you're not technically a professional in the space?
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't say that I limit myself, mm-hmm. other than the fact that I have to pay my own bills. And so I have to keep a full-time job until the writing becomes a little more lucrative, right? And the limiting there, the sort of force function is like, there's only so much time that I can dedicate to the mental health endeavors because I have to have a full-time job. I got to, for right now, keep the lights on and pay the bills and whatnot. I think one thing that might be interesting to talk about a little bit, and, obviously the theme of the season is Ray Dalio's principles and whatnot. And I kind of saw myself like talking about some of the principles without necessarily strictly addressing them. Right. So it's like one of the principles that he talks about, and maybe you were going to get to this at some point. So like, I think his first life principle is embrace reality and deal with it. Mm-hmm. And in so many ways, right, what I talked about, or what like my story from 5 minutes ago is kind of that, right? In a nutshell, it's like, okay, I found myself 10 years ago being like, I am really struggling with this stuff and I don't know what to do. There were times along that journey, and probably even further back than that, where I said to myself, I'm going to push this down. I'm not going to deal with it. I'm not going to think about it. And like, maybe it will go away, or maybe I'm just living in ignorance and like, that's my coping strategy because I don't know what else to do. Mm-hmm. A couple of years after that, or maybe, I don't know, maybe a year after that, got to the point where I was like, these struggles are reemerging. And I got to the point where I said, there is no choice left but to embrace this and deal with it. Right. I think what Dalio kind of says, and he talks about it too, like in some of his other principles in terms of like being radically open-minded and whatnot, is, if you like, the goal, I think, of embracing reality and dealing with it is sort of like, okay, I'm going to say, this is the current situation. Now, if I diagnose that properly, I can then work on it, right? I can craft solutions for that reality rather than like working on some problem that doesn't actually exist and whatnot. And, getting into the writing and talking about my approach to the writing and my endeavors there in general was like, sure, I could have written a book where it was like, I glossed over a bunch of things and I talked about only, let's say, sexy things, right? Like in terms of like, look, I'll be totally honest. Like my first book is mostly like a failed love story. It was like I was pursuing this woman who wasn't really that interested in me. I was kind of devastated and whatnot. And it's so embarrassing to talk about that stuff. But if I didn't talk about that, I would not be serving my audience, right? Because they're going through struggles just like that, whether they're sexy or not. The other thing in terms of radical open-mindedness is like, if I was not willing, and I don't say this in a self-aggrandizing way, this is to the entire audience, right? If we are not willing to be open-minded and to be transparent in what we are going through, one, like we're not going to face, we're not going to adhere to principle number one. We're not going to face reality. And two, we're not going to learn nearly as much as we need to learn in order to then move along and learn things more quickly. So that, Dalio kind of ties that in. He's like, basically, look at a situation, be realistic about it, and then say, like, I'm putting my hand up, I'm talking to as many people as I can and figuring this thing out as quickly as I can because I want to move past it and get back to whatever else it is I'm trying to get back to. So a little bit of a tangent there, but I thought that would be a good tie-in.
Yeah, no, it was actually a perfect tie-in.